Hey, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host. And today's episode is a little bit different than a traditional guest episode. So I did a roundtable recording with Robert Sikes and Kim Howerton. And we basically just chatted all about metabolic flexibility, chatted about all things keto. I got grilled with a lot of questions pertaining to metabolic flexibility. And we kind of just went through our opinions on it, our opinions on keto, incorporating carbs, kind of our experience with both ourselves and then also working with a bunch of different types of clients. So this is a really, really fun discussion. I thought it would be cool to share it on my podcast. Robert and Kim also shared this episode on their podcast as well. So yeah, without further ado, let's just dive into it. And I hope you enjoy the podcast with Robert Sikes and Kim Howerton.
And we're live. Kim and Rachel, how are you?
Good.
Nobody wants to talk over it.
Here we go.
The lag effect has already begun. It's hard when we're doing 3 people remote podcasts, but we're going to make it work.
Yeah, we'll do our best.
So Kim, it was your idea to have us all have this roundtable discussion. So I'd love for you to just kind of introduce the concept as to what this conversation will likely entail.
Sure. So, I love Rachel and Robert. And so I wanted to bring them into this conversation because I thought it'd be an interesting conversation to have. Like, we are all 3 people that work with different populations in the sort of health and food space. And they're either fully keto or keto adjacent or whatever you want to call it. And we all have, our opinions based on who we see, who we work with, and our own personal experiences. And the 3 of us have differences. I would say we agree much more than we disagree, but specifically in the area of metabolic flexibility, I was thinking, who better than MetFlex and Chill, right? To bring into the conversation, because our filters are on when we have these conversations a lot, but then we actually talk to each other with differing opinions, but people we respect. And we're like, oh, that makes sense too. And so I thought each of our audiences would probably benefit from hearing from a very well thought out perspective or getting the questions. Like, I don't know if you guys have this experience. I will listen to somebody else on a podcast and be like, ask this question, and nobody asks it. And so I thought this might be an opportunity.
I love it.
Yeah, same.
Just to clarify here for anybody listening, it's Robert Sikes, Rachel Gregory, Kim Howerton. That's the 3 people talking right now. And everybody should know each of us. But could we do like a quick little intro, I guess, for anybody that is not aware, because this is going to be published on all 3 of our platforms here.
Yeah.
Go for it, Rachel.
Go, Rachel.
Me? Okay. My name's Rachel Gregory. I am the founder of MetFlex Life. I've been kind of in the keto low carb space since 2014. I can't even remember what year it is anymore. And I got into the space. I did the first study looking at the effects of a low carb ketogenic diet in CrossFit athletes for my master's degree in exercise physiology and nutrition. And that's what kind of propelled me into this lifestyle. Got really interested in keto, started working with clients, obviously adopted the lifestyle for myself for a long time. Tried out many, many different things, went down many different rabbit holes, as I feel like we all do, and kind of got to this place probably 2 years ago where it just wasn't working for me anymore in terms of I developed this very kind of negative connotation behind carbs. I had a really bad fear of incorporating carbs into my lifestyle. And I knew that it was something that I needed to kind of address. And so I kind of looked into this idea of metabolic flexibility and realizing that you can, benefit from both sides of things, and you might not necessarily need to be on the extreme sides of each spectrum to get the benefits, especially if you're someone, in my opinion, who's not suffering from, any type of metabolic disease, or you don't have, a severe psychological issue with carbohydrates. So that's kind of my background in terms of metabolic flexibility, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And yeah, I don't want to talk too much.
I love it. What you got, Kim?
Well, so I'm Kim Howerton, and I'm a keto coach. I still primarily am working within the keto space. And I am somebody who went keto over 4 years ago to deal with my own personal metabolic dysregulation. I've been a life coach before then. So I've been a coach for a very, very long time. But I've been kind of in the more relationship and interpersonal space. And then I went keto, and finally, like, this piece of the puzzle of my life kind of fell into place for me. And from then forward, I was like, oh, I actually have to do my work here in this space around metabolic health, because ultimately they're both important. It's very rewarding to save a marriage. It feels better to give somebody the tools to save their life. And very few marriages survive death, right? So it's important to me to really be part of the change that we need in our world to have people healthy. And so that's where I put my attention and my focus now. And I continue to myself be a ketoer and a low carber, but I'm also in this time period, especially since we've been shelter in place a bit more, doing more experiments, seeing what's going on, using a CGM, and really looking at my boundaries personally. And also, it's interesting being currently an insulin sensitive person in the keto space, and what does that mean and what does that look like? And we can get into that a bit more, but my transition had gone from being insulin resistant, and now I'm insulin sensitive, but I'm not a skinny insulin sensitive person. I'm sort of a slightly fluffy insulin sensitive person. So what does that mean in the space, and what does that mean in my health journey, and what kind of people I tend to work with and what impact that has on them.
Nice. As far as I'm concerned, I'm Robert Sikes, Keto Savage, and I've been keto since 2014 or 15. I can't remember now, but I've been natural bodybuilding that whole time. I've been bodybuilding now for about 13 years, I want to say. Half of it was prior to keto. Then I developed a bunch of eating disorders, and then went keto to try and correct course with those, and just kind of made that my new norm. Experienced a lot of performance benefit from it, and have pretty much committed myself to optimizing a strict ketogenic approach for natural bodybuilding specifically, but also just performance in general. And I built a brand, a podcast, and a business around that concept. So it'll be interesting for the conversation today, because I am definitely kind of pegged as the strict keto guy, and Rachel is not the strict keto gal. So are you going to be like the moderator here, Kim, or how does this whole trifecta work?
I am indeed the younger child in my family, so I like everyone to get along, and so that might be my role.
I think as long as we're more civil than the presidential debates, we're kind of come out ahead.
I think we could make a fabulous. I don't know if you can have three people it's been a while since they've done the three rules of government, but we can do that.
Yeah, there you go. So how do y'all want to structure this? Do we want to just kind of, I think defining how we would define metabolic flexibility would be advantageous for the audience, the listeners, because metabolic flexibility has definitely become a buzzword as of late, it seems. So just kind of drawing some clarity as to what that means to us would be advantageous.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want me to kind of give my, how I usually describe it?
I would love that, Rachel.
Okay. So really just kind of to describe it in the simplest way, it's metabolic flexibility to me is really just being able to go back and forth between, the two main fuel sources that we have for energy, right? Carbohydrates and fats. And really kind of like in our modern day, right? Especially in America, where there's a lot of us and a lot of people who are, subject to these, diseases that are going rampant, right? Type 2 diabetes, obesity, all of that. And so a lot of that is pretty much stemming from just like the overconsumption of food and processed food and just having that, every day, like in our site every single day. Like we have grocery stores and delivery dudes and all that. Is it called delivery dudes or no? DoorDash, whatever it is. Yeah. Where you can just have everything at your fingertips, right? Which is not how like we evolved as humans, right? So the concept of metabolic flexibility to me is just being able to move between fuel sources when it's necessary. So, if you are sitting at your desk during the day and you're just, sedentary, you're just working, you're focusing, you should be able to tap into your, fat stores for fuel, right? You should be able to use fat as a fuel source where, most of us can't. Most of, modern day people, I guess you could say, we can't do that. We get these hunger pains, we get these energy fluctuations, headaches, things like that, because we're so used to having carbohydrates as our main fuel source. And especially like in America, that's what's, touted. Like the standard American diet is high carb. So that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is if you are, you go on a keto low carb diet for a long time, you may start to become, metabolically inflexible the other way, where when you want to consume carbs, or when maybe it's necessary for you to consume carbs, you're not really able to use those carbs as effectively because you're metabolically inflexible the other way. So really my goal with metabolic flexibility and kind of getting the word out about it is just trying to help people see that there is, like, you can have this in between. And like I said, to me, the spectrum is, and this is kind of how I explain it. Like if you are, overweight or obese and you're sedentary, right, then you're probably on the spectrum on the one side, or let's say the left side of the spectrum, where maybe you don't need, that many carbs, right? And your body does not do well with that many carbs. So that would be more of like, okay, let's take a keto low carb approach there. Maybe you are insulin resistant. We'll work through that, right? And then as you move more towards the other side of the spectrum, or if you already are on the other side of the spectrum where you are maybe lean, active, maybe you do a lot of high intensity training, things like that, you could probably do just fine with some carbs like in your lifestyle, right? So it really, in my opinion, comes down to like where you're starting, where you're at, what your metabolic health is like, and then also what your psychological health is like, right? So there's some people who absolutely can, follow low carb ketogenic diet for forever, and they enjoy it and they love it, and they don't ever have any need or want to consume carbs, which is totally fine. But then there's another side of the spectrum where there's people who have gone keto low carb for a long time. And this is personally my experience, and all the people that I tend to work with, like all the clients I work with, they went keto, they found great results. They got great results. And then they kind of got to this place where they became carb phobic. And anytime they wanted to, maybe have something that wasn't lower carb, or even something, like a cookie or a cupcake or whatever at a wedding, I always use this example, they would feel like severe guilt behind that, right? And they wouldn't, it would just be this big negative event and cause some down spirals for some things. So my kind of take on that is, we got to figure out where you're at, where you're coming from, what your goals are long-term. Like, do you feel like you can follow a keto low carb lifestyle for the rest of your life? And do you want to do that? Or do you want to incorporate carbs strategically for where you're at in your life, for your goals? And can you balance that for your lifestyle? So that's really kind of, I'm going to stop mumbling on here, but that's really how I see metabolic flexibility is your body's metabolic ability to use both carbs and fats as a fuel source, as different fuel sources at different times. But then also I like to take it a step further and go towards like the psychological side of things, where, okay, we're living in this modern world where we have these things, every single day. We have events to go to and whatever they may be. And so that's the other side of things that I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily take into account in terms of that flexibility side of things. Okay, I'm done talking.
Anything to add, Kim?
Sure. So yeah, I totally agree in my that metabolic flexibility as a concept is the idea that you are somebody that could burn either carbs or, glucose or fats as your main fuel source. And I think the thing that Rachel did totally say, but I want to really emphasize, is that our society, I would say, I kind of look at this like we have the general population, and then we've got what I call sporty peeps, right? Like the people who work out a lot, it's just part of their life. Like they don't actually every day think, oh, I got to start working out now. Like they actually do it. And the general population, and I would say if we look at the general population, I would say almost all of them are not fat adapted. They are only carb adapted, right? They have insulin resistance, which means they have a big barrier to being able to burn fat for fuel. And I find the barrier to becoming fat adapted to be a much steeper climb from where we are currently. I don't think that this has been true evolutionarily I don't think this is true back in the day before there was a McDonald's on every corner. But I think that currently we're in a place where the road to fat adaptation for a lot of people is extremely important and much more challenging than what I would say is perhaps the road to becoming to balancing between. Like the first important step seems to be for 99% of the population to become fat adapted as a stage one.
Totally agree. Like if we're looking at it from like standard population's viewpoint, I mean, I'm in 100% complete agreement with the concept of metabolic flexibility. Like anybody that's following a standard American diet and hasn't been in a state of ketosis since birth, they would absolutely benefit from, becoming fat adapted and then having that metabolic flexibility on their side, because at the moment they certainly are not metabolically flexible. I think where we may differ is that I'm not really convinced that if on the reverse end of that spectrum, you're going to have the metabolic inflexibility if you're keto and then not able to tap into carbs. For instance, I've been strict keto now for 6 years, but if I was to eat carbs, if I was to eat a bunch of rice or sushi or something of that nature, I don't feel like I would have near the uphill battle to become to be able to tap into that for fuel as a standard American diet follower would, in the reverse of that, using fat for fuel. So I'm not convinced that our body forgets how to use carbs as a fuel source. There may be a little bit of discomfort, an adaptation phase in the first couple of days, but I feel like once you were to incorporate that, your body would recognize that as fuel and be able to tap into it and use it as energy pretty rapidly. So I'm not necessarily convinced that from a performance standpoint, you're going to become metabolically inflexible on the reverse standpoint. So that's probably where we differ from a physiological standpoint. From a psychological standpoint, I think we're probably agreeing on everything. We're attacking it from two different perspectives. So I don't think people should be carb phobic at all. And I don't want that to cause them to spiral out of control. That would obviously not be good or sustainable or enjoyable. But I'm coming at it from the perspective of not letting carbs have such a impression on your life in the first place. So like if you're at a wedding and you want to have a piece of cookie and you're going to feel guilty if you have that cookie, you're suggesting that you eat the cookie and be okay with it. I'm suggesting that you not let the cookie have such a hold on you in the first place. So it's just kind of a different perspective over the same desired outcome, I believe.
Yeah. I don't know when to talk.
Yeah, this is the quick disclaimer for anybody listening. We're doing this all audio, so we can't really see each other's mannerisms. If someone's raising their hand, we can't see that. So we're just kind of hoping that we get the flow right.
Yeah. We should. We could have recorded video, but it wouldn't have come out as clear. So, and I didn't do my hair, so.
Yeah, we can't do video if you
that
haven't.
Was the
hair.
main reason,
right?
But yeah, so I mean, from a physical standpoint, I'd love to dive into that. I mean, is there much research? And I'm probably not near as knowledgeable about the research that I should be, but is there any significant studies that are well conducted that illustrate that your body forgets how to use glucose for energy after you've been keto? I mean, there may be that slight adaptation period, as I'm sure there would be just as if you're going from keto to carnivore, there's a slight adaptation period from a digestive standpoint, from an absorption standpoint. But long term, I wouldn't assume your body would forget how to use glucose as it does forget how to use fat if you've not been fat adapted.
Sorry, Kim, you can go.
No. Okay. I was going to say that I think Rachel's probably the right one to round out this question, but I think, this conversation we definitely need to bring up the concept of adaptive glucose sparing. Once you become fat adapted, you might note that your body just doesn't seem to want to do the right thing when you take in carbs, which can lead to really big blood glucose excursions. Essentially, your muscles are like, no, we don't need you, glucose, thanks, head out. And it, kicks it back into your bloodstream. And so, the question I have, though, is everything I've ever seen says, within about 3 days of eating a moderate carb diet, you are back to being able to deal with carbs super well. And, to differentiate that adaptive glucose sparing is in no way pathological. It's physiological insulin resistance and very quickly overcome. So I know there are studies that show this adaptive glucose sparing, which is, again, often called physiological insulin resistance. But like, to Robert's question, beyond those sort of like, oh yeah, let me get my insulin producing the right amount, let me get this response curve back, which seems to take 2 to 3 days, beyond there, are there additional benefits?
Yeah. So I honestly don't think that we have like many studies like looking at this, right? Like looking at someone who's been, following a low carb diet for a long time, fat adapted, and then incorporating, carb. There are some studies, like I said, incorporating carbohydrates, but then like the after, right? I think my biggest thing with that is just like it's just looking like you said, Kim, the blood sugar response to that. But then it's also like I guess it's kind of thinking like long-term, like what does the individual want to get out of it? Like, that's where I come like, that's what I'm looking at. Like, I'm not necessarily looking at all the physiological stuff that's actually going on. I'm kind of looking at more so at the practical sense of like the person's lifestyle, in the sense of, okay, do they want to, feel comfortable incorporating carbs like on the weekend, or maybe even just, once or twice a month without having that guilt behind it? And does their body, bounce back effectively from that? So that's really kind of like where like I'm looking at it from. And I guess you could say it's more so the psychological side of things when it comes to the metabolic flexibility kind of realm. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Yes. It's like a mental flexibility.
Yeah.
Over like, because one of the questions that come up for me is like, okay, I like carbs. I can push myself to my carb max, right? Like, I can know that I don't have blood sugar problems if I keep the carbs under X. So I'm going to push it to that max. And there might be emotional benefit there, right? Like, I can go out with my friends for lunch easier. I don't have to deny myself when I think I have a craving. You have these sort of, maybe to some people a benefit, to some people not, but a potential more expansion in that area on emotional level. But the question that always comes up for me is it's this concept of like getting away with it. Like, oh, I can get away with this many carbs, no big deal. But is there an actual benefit beyond that? It makes some people feel happier.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the psychological aspect, but I'd love to, let's just cover the physical first, and then we'll move more into the mental/emotional, because they're both very, very key.
Totally important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from a physical standpoint, then what I don't know, I guess we can break this down multiple different ways. From a insulin resistant standpoint, I have noticed that people like Sean Baker, for instance, he's been open about how his blood glucose tends to rise. His baseline blood glucose is often north of 100, but he's obviously not eating any carbohydrates. So some people have pointed to that as being an example of the insulin resistance from not having the carbs. But he's also eating a ton of protein. I think the macronutrient ratio breakdown is incredibly relevant there. I think the amount of caloric surplus or deficit is very relevant. For instance, when I'm in a building phase and I'm eating at a significant caloric surplus, more of which is protein, my blood glucose always tends to be a little bit higher. not in an unhealthy range, but always a little bit higher. When I'm in a deficit and I'm at a higher fat ratio, that drops down to 60s or 70s milligrams per deciliter. So I think that is incredibly relevant. And then also from a hormonal standpoint, I feel like one of the big arguments for incorporating carbohydrates falls on the females who have been irregular with their cycle. They've noticed that they've missed their period for several months. They'll incorporate some carbs and they'll see that resurface. And I'd love for y'all to talk on that, because that's a little bit more outside my wheelhouse than it is y'all. But for me, what I've noticed is that is very much so related and correlated to overall caloric intake. If someone is at a significant deficit in calories and they incorporate carbs, that could elicit a period response. But if they are at a healthy caloric intake, at a maintenance or at a surplus, they're oftentimes able to maintain a regular cycle in the complete absence of carbohydrates.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I agree with kind of the caloric intake side of things, where it might not necessarily, like there has been a few, like I know of like one specific study that looked at leptin levels with incorporating carbohydrates, but there really hasn't been, too many, in the sense of like when you do, incorporate carbohydrates, and what your leptin response is. Cause I know that's something that a lot of people tend to say, like, oh, like your leptin levels are kind of out of whack, so incorporate carbs and they'll kind of level out. From my research, I haven't seen, actual too many studies on that. But I think, like you said, Robert, it is like the caloric intake side of things. Like if you are someone who is suffering with, not having a period, or you've been in a calorie deficit for a while and some hormonal things are going on, the first thing, like absolutely increasing your calorie intake should take care of a lot of those things, whether that calorie intake does come from carbs or fats, right? One of the things I would say is that we do know from research and from research that there is kind of an inverse response to spiking insulin and cortisol. So when you do spike your insulin levels, it kind of has the opposite effect on cortisol, and cortisol we know is our stress hormone. So there are some instances when, that can help to mitigate some of the negative effects if you do have, if you're constantly in a sympathetic state, right? If you're constantly in this fight or flight mode and your cortisol is chronically elevated, having those spikes in insulin could potentially bring that cortisol down, specifically, after a workout, to get more into that recovery mode and that more in that parasympathetic state. And that's just from kind of like the practical and I guess real world application side of things. That's what I've seen for myself and with a lot of the women clients that I work with. When we start to start to incorporate carbs after workouts, that can be something that can help get back into that parasympathetic state. Not saying that's the only thing, right? But that could be one thing. So yeah, that would be kind of my take on that side of things. But I do agree with you in terms of the overall calorie intake is probably the most important thing when it comes to kind of our hormones, right? And getting those back to a good level if you have been in a chronic deficit.
Yeah.
Right. And I will add that I think it's a context, right? Like one of the main reasons for infertility and hormonal issues in women being off is actually hyperinsulinemia, right? Like PCOS, a lot of people who are suffering from hormonal issues, a lot of women who are suffering from hormonal issues, the root is hyperinsulinemia, too high in insulin, that insulin resistance. And then on the other but those people tend not to be, super thin, super working out a lot. They're kind of on the other end of the spectrum. But again, U-shaped curve, right? You go to the far end on the other side and you've got people who are like type A, push it to the limit, working out 7 days a week, really stressing out their body in a lot of other ways. Maybe their body fat percentage has dropped fairly low, or, they're maybe a little under muscled to the comparisons. They might be skinny fat, but they're not, necessarily having just constant high insulin. And, those people definitely, I think, to what Rachel was talking about, a more nuanced approach and making sure that they're not overly stressing in every single area of their life, including caloric restriction, is also a very important intervention in terms of hormonal regulation.
Yeah, I totally agree that, especially from like a nutrient absorption standpoint, like if I'm going to have a meal post-workout, then the more efficiently I can return to a parasympathetic state, the better my body is going to be able to absorb any of the food I consume. So I'm all for, having like a legitimate cool down, having like a period of meditation, taking a cold, shower, something to reset things and get you back into that parasympathetic state to improve nutrient absorption. I guess my fear is that, when you look at the keto community as a whole, for instance, the vast majority is, middle-aged women who need and want to lose weight, and they've burned out on alternative dieting methods, and they're looking to keto to fix that. Now, there's obviously a much broader range there, but my fear is that they'll be in the keto space looking to accomplish just that. They'll hear this message of metabolic flexibility, and they'll latch onto that because they get to have their cake and eat it too, supposedly. And they're coming at it from a place of being metabolically unsound because they've probably chronically undereaten the vast majority of their life. So metabolism's downregulated. So they're the worst candidate to start incorporating a bunch of carbs because they're probably insulin resistant and they're not focusing on building the muscle tissue that's going to help their metabolism in the first place. And then they're going to start introducing carbohydrates because it's more sustainable for them emotionally. And then it basically just creates this perfect storm environment for them to not make the progress they're so needing to make.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's something that, like the way that I kind of go about it is always, looking at first where the person's coming from. And if they are, like I said, this spectrum, like if they are overweight, if they are maybe insulin sensitive, then I think, incorporating a ketogenic low carb diet is the absolute best place to start. And then once we can get that under control, right, if they do want to start to incorporate carbs again, that's kind of where I come in to help kind of do that in a way that's not, doesn't have a negative connotation around it, right? And focusing on, the whole food carbs, right? And this is something too that I've seen and I've done it myself. It's like sometimes, like, I think I talked about this with you, Robert, on a few times ago we recorded, like, a few years ago, I would be looking to incorporate something, and instead of having, like a sweet potato, I would have like a keto ice cream filled with a bunch of like artificial stuff, right? And like looking for like kind of the keto alternative, I guess you could say. And so that's where I found just working with clients that tends to be like they start to incorporate more of these processed keto treats, right? Instead of looking at the whole food sources to kind of like mitigate that. And so that's where I kind of look at things in the sense of let's start to, and this is a good kind of maybe a transition into like flexible dieting itself, right? And how there's some issues behind that and what that actually means in terms of being flexible with your diet versus being flexible in the sense where you're like when we're going down kind of the rabbit hole of counting macros and things like that. And like, what are you actually eating, even if it fits into your macros? Because I feel like there's like a bunch of differences there as well. So does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think, the concept of metabolic flexibility is definitely a subset or different concept altogether than the flexible dieting or if it fits your macros. And there can absolutely be, there's a ton of nuance with all of this. So I always encourage people to place an emphasis on nutrient density and quality wholesome foods. I mean, I own a ketogenic meal replacement bar, and I'll always tell people to always opt for real food over anything else. I feel like a lot of people do try and incorporate all these these fillers, these treats, and that's that could be a whole psychological question or discussion as well. So we can absolutely dive into that. Go ahead.
There was one point that I think we're going to miss that I wanted to back up on. And this is not anything any of the three of us says, but there are people in the keto space who really emphasize that women need carb ups. And what I hear Rachel saying, which I kind of very much agree with, it's a nuanced discussion and one that has to do with a lot of, details and emotional and mental things, but The thing that I always bump up against in this one, and I just don't hear anyone raising this question a lot, so I thought I would do it before we moved on to the more mental side of things, is that there are people out there pushing that if you don't do a carb up every X number of days or whatever, you will screw up your hormones as a woman. Mm-hmm. And, you know, female hormones require these things. And I just wanted to put it out because, you know, in the discussion of metabolic flexibility, I think there's a different discussion between you need carbs, and carbs might be useful in certain circumstances, but it's a nuanced discussion, right? There's just sort of a very different conversation between those two. You know, Rachel, when you're working with people on this issue of metabolic flexibility, have you found that there are some people that you're like, well, keto's just not working on a hormonal level at all? You know, we've bumped up their calories, we've done everything, they're meditating, they're doing all these things except carbs. Carbs is the last thing to do, so we're going to do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it all comes down to where the person is coming from and like exactly what you said. Like, it's so individualized because it all depends. Like, what have you done in the past? Like, what have you tried? What have you not tried? What are the things, like, can we just list out these things and then we'll go through one by one? Okay. Yeah, this worked. Maybe it didn't work. Or maybe you tried this 2 years ago and it didn't work, but maybe let's try it again now and see where you're at. So I 100% think that, you know, and that's why I just love working and working as a coach and working with individuals through these things, because it's so individualized. Like, there's just so many different aspects of it that, like, I can't give a straight answer in terms of, yes, this is the way to go, or yes, this is, you know, carbs are absolutely necessary, because I don't think in terms of like absolute, like, I just don't think we can talk in absolutes, because I think everybody is just so coming from different places, right? So yes, if I'm working with if someone comes to me who, you know, is, you know, overweight and insulin resistant, and, you know, then carbs is probably like the last thing we're going to work on, right? But if you come to me and you are maybe, you know, at a lower body fat percentage, you are someone who is working out, you know, 6 days a week, you're a woman, you're overstressed, you have 5 kids, all this stuff. Like, yes, we're going to start to work on first the lifestyle side of things, right? Like, let's reduce your stress. Let's get you sleepy more. Let's, you know, focus on maybe not doing so much cardio. Let's do the things that we can get you back into this, or kind of reduce that stress bucket, right? Because we know we all have like a stress bucket, and it doesn't matter where the stress is coming from, right? Whether you're under eating, whether you are over exercising, whether you are just stressed out from like your kids or your husband or whatever it is, like, that's all going into the same stress bucket. So let's pinpoint those certain things, whether you're under sleeping, right? Like, those are the main things that we'll hit first. And then, okay, if none of, like, all that's in check, if you have all those boxes checked and things are still kind of wonky, then let's try something else. Let's try incorporating carbs. Let's see how you feel with that, right? So that's kind of how I go about it.
Just to clarify, though, Kim. Just to clarify, though, Kim, you were taking the perspective of someone that's heard that they're absolutely going to mess up their hormones if they don't consume carbs, right?
Right. I think, it's unfortunate. It's just the way of the world, right? Like, keto has become popular, and now every person uses the word keto in their ads, even if they're warning you against keto, and they're saying, if you don't incorporate carb ups, you will mess up your female hormones because keto is for men.
Can we all put that to rest right now? Like, I think I feel like we could safely all put that to rest, right?
I will.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the truth. I mean, like Crystal, as an example, my wife, she's been keto now for 5 years strictly, and she hasn't had any significant increase in carbs, and her hormones have never been better. So if that were the case, then she would be an anomaly, and I don't think she's an anomaly.
Mm-hmm. And she's also been working on eating more, right? Like, she's not been in a deficit for a while, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Yeah.
I think one of the things that all three of us actually have come to agree on, or I might have been late to the party because I heard about reverse dieting from Robert. But I think all three of us can probably agree that there is just an epidemic of under eating with a lot of women long term. And that in and of itself is a huge issue to deal with. And if that's not dealt with, then long term success is probably unlikely.
Yes, I will 100% vouch on that for sure.
Agreed.
There is one thing I wanted to touch on from a physical performance standpoint before we dive into the psychological aspect, and that is that a lot of people, especially in the bodybuilding space, they have become convinced that carbs are, like, we can all agree that athletes can tolerate more carbs than a non-athlete. I think we're all in agreement there. Someone that is an athlete, someone that's burning through their glycogen during their training, they're going to be able to consume more dietary carbohydrates and get away with it and benefit from it than someone that's not an athlete. However, my argument is that while that is very much so the case, you don't have to have those carbohydrates to improve your performance, and you can do so on a strict ketogenic protocol. Like, I just wanted to throw that out there because I think there's a lot of nuance to that. And I do feel like level of adaptation matters. That's why I've been so adamant about strict keto for me personally, because I feel like the more deeply you adapt to any one thing, the better and more efficient your body becomes at that one thing. That stands to reason for most things in life. So my take is that for me personally, as a strict ketogenic athlete, my body's ability to perform at a high level in my athletic endeavors is only benefiting from staying strict.
I'm like, do I talk or does Ken talk?
On this topic, you go, Rachel. Yeah. It's not really my wheelhouse.
No, I was going to say, I agree with that. Like, I don't think carbs are absolutely necessary to benefit you in terms of bodybuilding, in terms of performance, in the sense that everybody is told, right? Like, you need carbs to perform well. I think it is a big adaptation side of things, like becoming more obviously fat adapted, the more efficient you're going to become. So that's not like, I don't really take that side of things. And I actually work, like, a lot of the clients I work with are not like I can just think of one client, Robert, we actually chatted about this like 2 weeks ago. One of my clients I've been working with for, I think, like 5 or 6 months, she just had a photo shoot, and she like came to me, and she is like, she was overweight. She found keto, lost a bunch of weight and felt really good, but just needed to dial in other things. And she just enjoys eating more carnivore, right? And very low carbs. And she had great results. And we never, like, over the 5 or 6 months working together, prepping her for a photo shoot, like, we never did any carb ups. We never incorporated any carbs. So, and she was feeling good with her lifts and all of that, and had a really great result with her photo shoot. So again, it's not like I'm coming from a place where I'm like, yes, you have to have carbs to perform well and to, be your best self and be the healthiest version of you. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the sense of, try and dip things out. Like, if you hit a standstill, right, and you've done all the other things, like, okay, let's not fear this. Let's, use it for our benefit and do it in a strategic way that it can benefit us. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you on that, Robert.
Totally. So just to recap, from a physiological standpoint, we're all in agreement that probably first and foremost is to become metabolically healthy, metabolically sound, become insulin sensitive. So probably, being fat adapted, obviously, eating adequate calories, having periods of being in a caloric surplus and benefiting from that, kind of reestablishing a baseline foundation there. And then from a performance standpoint, one is not necessarily better than the other. It's kind of more a matter of which your body is most adapted to, and like a preferential thing almost, more so than anything. Is that kind of where we're all standing currently?
Yeah, I would say I agree with that. I would say, in the sense of just performance wise, and like, like, obviously I did the first study on CrossFit and keto, and that study I just want to mention because a lot of people see that study and they're like, oh, you can't do high intensity exercise, especially CrossFit, without carbs. You can do it. And from the study, the main kind of premise of the study was looking at, non-elite CrossFit athletes with the main goal of going to CrossFit, 3 or 4 times a week, with that being their exercise, but their main goal is actually to lose body fat, right? So they, they progress with that. But when it comes to like doing highly glycolytic sports where glucose is like the main fuel source, I'm not saying you can't do that, fat adapted and strict keto. But it might be, advantageous to incorporate carbs, especially like on targeted, like with a targeted approach around your workout, if you are doing more high intensity work like CrossFit, especially if performance in that type of sport, right, is your main goal, right? If your main goal is to increase performance with a sport that is highly glycolytic versus maybe like bodybuilding, which is not a highly glycolytic sport, right? So that's kind of like the one place where I would say that maybe carbs could be more beneficial for just from like an overall standpoint. But again, this comes back to the person who is focused primarily on performance in a sport that is highly glycolytic.
I agree.
Right.
Oh, go ahead, Kim.
No, you go.
I agree. However, that is where my theory of length and level of adaptation comes into play. So if you're taking someone, for instance, that's been adapted for 6 months, has great ketone levels, et cetera, you know, they would probably benefit totally from having those strategic carbs in glycolytic demanding activities. However, like for me, using myself as an example, being strict keto now for 6 months, my body's ability to replenish glycogen through a strict ketogenic diet is so much more efficient than it was. I don't use as much glycogen even in those glycolytic demanding sports. I mean, I've done CrossFit, I've done these different types of activities, and I mean, this is totally anecdotal, so I don't know if it's going to hold much weight in the court of law, but I'm able to keep up and surpass the output of people that are leveraging carbohydrates. And I think that's really where you have to lean on how deeply adapted you truly are.
Yeah. But I would say also, like, I'm just curious, like, have you, because I know you've been strict keto for a long, long time. And I'm just curious, like, if you have any inclination to try to incorporate carbs and do like an experiment on yourself to see like how you react to that. Because I know you said like you know your body can handle those, but have you actually done the experiment? I'm just curious. Not trying to put you on the spot.
No, so I have not incorporated carbs since being keto. However, prior to going into keto, I was doing a bunch of carb backloading, and I was doing bodybuilding the total wrong way. So I would definitely be in a state of ketosis just simply from a caloric decrease and carb restriction. Now I wasn't fat adapted nearly as deeply as I am now, so it would be an interesting experiment. But I'm of the mindset, for me personally, that I'm getting so much better due to my level of adaptation that I don't want to screw that up by conducting that experiment, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
And it's
I guess what I wanted to say. Ooh, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you out there. It's hard because my theory will likely not be proven because nobody's going to be able to get a test pool of applicants willing to be strict keto for long enough and be able to conduct a scientific study on. So I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot by making that a theory in the first place.
Would you ever consider doing an experiment, like just to see? Like if I had a gun to your head and I was like, eat carbohydrates.
Yeah, if you had a gun to my head, I probably would eat carbohydrates.
That's not the best experiment, Rachel. Rachel, that's not an experiment.
I know.
We were
that
friends,
will not
Rachel.
get past the IRB.
No, but in all seriousness, like, have you ever thought, like, I'm just curious, like, have you ever thought about doing, I know, like, well, because at your level of adaptation, this is like what I'd be most interested in seeing, like how, like, because you are probably the person that I know, the one person I know who's as adapted as you are, right? I don't think I know anybody else who's been like strict for as long as you have. So I would just be curious to see like how you do react to carbs and like how, how that would look. But
yeah, totally. I mean, I'm honestly incredibly curious as well. And I'm not carb phobic at all. Like I would totally eat carbs from that standpoint and not, wheel into depression or anything like that. But it has become a psychological thing for me at this point because I've been strict keto for this long. I feel like as an influencer, as somebody in the space, a lot of people that do not have a good relationship with carbs look to me as a source of inspiration to know that they can perform at a high level following a strict ketogenic approach. And I can tolerate carbs much better than they could, but I don't want to do them wrong in a sense by taking that away from being the strict keto guy. So it's like this weird relationship that's totally much more psychological than it is physiological at this point. So I don't want to do that experiment, but I am incredibly curious to see what that experiment would result in.
Same. But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, just because coming around to point this out, like what this debate that happens a lot in this keto space, right, is like, do you need carbs? Like, should targeted carbs be a thing? Really applies to the upper echelon athlete. Like, this is a very small population compared to the wide world of keto. And so I want to put it out there to the listeners that if you're a CrossFit athlete, this might apply to you, but it might not apply to, the woman who hasn't been to the gym in several years or decades.
Yeah.
And so, just to put a point on it. And then the thing that I wanted to say was, like, somebody like Zach Bitter, right? Who he trains low carb, keto, and then he does use, as far as I know, some carbs pre-race. This is a person who's extremely fat adapted and stays fat adapted. And when they strategically add those carbs in a elite racing situation, I almost look at them not like an illegal drug, but I almost look like that application of carbs is like, I guess you could call it a supplement, right? Like, rather than sort of one of their main nutrient sources in that performance example, rather than, because it's not how they live every day. They're staying fat adapted all the time, but they might apply a bit of targeted glucose to a performance situation, which I see as very different than just day-to-day life.
Yeah, totally. And I don't want to put any words in Zach's mouth because I don't recall, but I'm pretty sure I heard him talking on a Rogan podcast that he is not strict keto all the time by any means. I mean, he'll eat carbs even when he's not doing a race. I don't think he eats a ton of them.
I think so.
But I think he just goes back and forth. And in that situation, then yeah, I feel like, his body would be, quote unquote, very metabolically flexible, and he could benefit from having a mix of both. I don't think it would be required. Like, if Zach was to say, hey, I'm just going to be strict keto all the way, and that was his new norm, and that was his norm for enough time that his body became deeply adapted, I think he could totally excel as an ultramarathon runner without carbs. But I think he just chooses to incorporate both.
Okay, bad example. Pick another. Insert other name there.
But I don't know. I don't know Zach's exact protocol there.
Well, I would just say, like, just to go off your point of, a targeted keto approach, that's usually, when I'm like working with clients, and again, just bringing this all back to practicality and where the person's coming from. If you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I do want to try this, or, no, I'm good. But if, like, from the practical sense, like when I'm working with clients and we are going to incorporate carbs and it is someone who is, working out, then we, transition first to that targeted approach, because like Robert said, we know, when you are incorporating carbs, especially around your workout, we know that your muscles are more insulin sensitive, and the fact that they will, absorb those carbs a little bit better post-workout, especially versus another time a day. Like, if you're just like sitting on the couch doing nothing. So I think that is definitely, like, if you're looking for somewhere to start, like, maybe start with, and this is something that we do, like, start with the minimal effective dose, right? Like, don't just go from eating 50 carbs to eating like 200 carbs or 300 carbs or whatever. Like, start with the minimal effective dose in the sense of, like, try out to see what works for you. And again, this is so different for everybody, right? Because we are all our own individuals. So
yeah, totally. I
mean, and I think, like, for me, before I'll open the door, like, because I'm working with a more perhaps metabolically deranged population than you guys might, not to put words in your mouth. I'm sure you work with lots of different people, but the population that I work with, my rules that I've come up with recently is sort of some cutoff points is, like, if your fasting insulin isn't under 5 and your C-peptide isn't under 1.6 and your A1C is over 5.4, probably you shouldn't open that door, right? You have to meet some physiological health markers around metabolic health before we start to really flex, if you will.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I see a lot of people, sadly, who the appeal of introducing a greater variety to their plate is very strong, and they look at an athlete that is able to get away with eating a plate full of sushi and assume that they can as well. So they'll have a massive bolus of carbs in justification of the workout they just did, which was simply cleaning the house, which is not a good representation, I don't think.
Yeah. I agree with that. I would say one thing that I would say with this is just in terms of that, like I totally agree with, again, that spectrum, like where are you at on that spectrum will kind of determine like potentially like where you're going to, like what you're going to do, right? What you're going to try out,
Right.
if you are going to incorporate carbs or not. But then just from like a psychological side of things, I've seen kind of, especially if maybe you are on that spectrum and you're at the point where maybe all of those markers are not telling you to incorporate carbs, but you are psychologically in a place where, maybe you're trying to just fight against not doing that. And then it ends up becoming something where you go out and binge on, a milkshake and a Big Mac or something, right? Versus if we were to strategically maybe incorporate a little bit more whole foods carbs in the sense that maybe we are, tapping into that psychological side of things and giving you a little bit of what you're, maybe you want, and then we're not maybe getting to the point where you're overdoing it and that binge is happening, right? So that's another thing from the psychological side of things, because, you might not be at the point where you should be incorporating carbs, but maybe it happens if you are being too restrictive in that sense. So that's just something else to kind of think about.
I agree.
Yeah, I hear you on that point in that, like, they wanted a carb salad, right? Or a Cobb salad. Wow, a
carb salad.
Hey, they wanted
new thing.
Right? They wanted a Cobb salad. They were like, oh, a big salad sounds good. No, I shouldn't have that. I'll have the, skinless chicken breast, and only that. And then like later that afternoon, they drive through Dunkin' Donuts. Like, I certainly think that there can be some choices made when you're not metabolically healthy yet, like there are still maybe slightly higher carb choices. And to one of these points, right? Like a lot of us who've been in this keto game a long time, like the carb line has been set very low at this point, right? Like 20 grams or less or you're not keto. A day of 40 grams of carbs because you had an avocado, might not be the worst thing. I think it's really a question of degrees and subtlety there versus, I am so restrictive in the way that I approach my way of ketoing that I then, my only pressure release valve is the drive-through.
Yes.
Yeah.
I totally agree on all front. I think we could all probably agree that at the end of the day, we don't want anybody to have this massively negative relationship with any food group. And if that is happening, then you're likely going to be miserable, and that's not good. And you're probably going to spiral out of control or binge or have developed some type of eating disorder, which is going to have a net negative outcome regardless of what dietary protocol you're following. So I think it just becomes a matter of what do you find to be most sustainable, and sustainable in a way that hedges your bets and puts your trajectory on the right path going forward. And typically, like with the metabolic flexibility approach, you're taking more of a moderation approach. And with me being strict keto, I'm taking more of an elimination approach. And there's going to be groups of people that do better with moderation. There's going to be groups of people that do better with elimination. I don't think one is right or wrong. I think it's just going to become very individualized. But I think the way you tackle that and your relationship with that approach is key.
Agreed.
And I do think also that there's a life cycle issue, right? Like, or, where are you? Like when I first started keto, I'm a data nerd, right? So like I would test my blood ketones, and if my total grams of carbs went over 29 grams, it was like a on-off switch, right? Like, and from Whole Foods, if I had some flackers, right, those flax seeds would kick me. I'd be like, wait, where are my ketones? And that's a very different situation than I'm in 4 years later. And that there is flexibility. I'm eating way more carbs now than I used to, but I'm still well under 50 a day, and and I'm still seeing ketones. My protein's different than it used to be. My fat level's different. Like over time, everything might shift in terms of what serves you best. And I think one of the enemies of sustainability is dogmatism, right? Is like, it has to be this way. This is the one way to do it. And I think probably all of us would agree that you have to be at least mentally flexible enough to say, I wonder if this is still the best thing for me to do.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think it also changes too. Like everything just changes over time. Like our bodies are constantly changing, especially like you said, when you first start off, like it's different 4 or 5 years ago than it might be now for where you're at, especially if you are becoming more metabolically healthy. So I think that's, very important to think about. And then it's also like to your point, Robert, about the elimination versus moderation side of things. I personally think that when it's like when we're talking about the moderation side of things, I think still we need to kind of talk to the like the processed food aspect of things, because personally for me, like if I have like, even if I am, incorporating more carbs in my life, which I do, like I will keep, sweet potatoes in the house and I'll keep fruit in the fridge and things like that. But I'm not going to keep a bag of chips in my cabinet or a box of Cinnamon Toast Crunch in my cabinet, because those things I can't moderate. And for most people, that I work with, and for most people, I think like those things are very, very hard to moderate because they just cause you to obviously overeat. So, and then same thing, like having ice cream in your fridge. And even if it is like keto ice cream too, like those are the things where it's more so talking to the fact that, you have to be very careful when you're kind of tipping this seesaw of moderation, because in this day and age, like it's just so hard to moderate those things that are so hyper palatable. And it's not saying that like, no, you shouldn't eat regular ice cream ever again, but like, don't keep it in the house. If you want to have, a scoop of regular ice cream, maybe you go out and have that, on a Friday night. And if that's something that you can incorporate and you can still feel good, and that kind of side of things with incorporating more carbs and having a little bit more of a treat in that sense, then do that. But then there's other people who can't even do that, right? Like, because it's so, psychologically draining. Like if they're going to go have a scoop of regular ice cream, like then they might even go back and have like 10 scoops, right? So it's one of those things. But I think the biggest thing is to think about like setting your personal environment up for what that you can adhere to best. And I think for most of us, no matter where you're at, that's probably keeping as much of the processed stuff out of the house as possible. Even if it is keto, if it is not keto, like do we all agree on that or no?
100%.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, one of the things that I deal with a lot with my clients, right? I do this coaching circle, and there was this couple of week series where we were all very focused on ice cream. So it just brought up this thought when you were just talking about. And, one of the things that we were talking about was, that this new brand of ice cream had come out that, that was keto and people wanted to try it. And so it was like, oh, okay. So I was talking to people and they'd be like, yeah, I ate more than I meant to. And I was like, well, describe what you did, and they're just eating it straight out of the carton. I'm like, okay, danger sign 1, if you do not have the self-control to put a serving in a bowl, right? That is a line we draw, and then it was like, the next one was like, well, I allow it in my macros if I don't have dinner. And I'm like, okay, wait, like that is another line we draw, like where you have to have, like, it's much more complicated is I guess what I'm saying. Like if you want to incorporate treats, which I'm actually for in certain circumstances, you have to have so much stronger mental, emotional boundaries around them. I don't have to draw like rules as much around broccoli, right? Like I don't, or even a sweet potato, right? I don't have to, but for some people, it might be a sweet potato, right? For me, it's any food that you feel like you lack control around. And so if there's any food, which, are probably going to be the more processed foods that you lack control around, you need to put up stronger barriers to abusing that food.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to go on a tangent here for a second, so bear with me. I think everything in life is cyclical. Energy is cyclical. Discipline is cyclical. Like you cannot be all one way 100% of the time. You will burn out. And I've learned this the hard way. But if you set yourself up so that you're trending in the right direction, the vast majority of the time, you will succeed on the macro level. So for me, Like when I'm doing a competition prep and I'm counting everything to the gram, I'm dialed in. Anything that is not 100% optimized is not in my nutrition, period. Like I leave nothing to chance. When I'm not in a competition prep, which I do not do all the time, I mean, it's very important to have periods where you're in a caloric surplus, like we talked about earlier. I'm a lot more lax. Like I'm still keto. I'm not taking anything that is distracting me or moving me in the wrong trajectory, but it's not 100% optimized, dialed in 100% of the time. Like for instance, it's hunting season now. I'll have more, like it was my birthday today. Somebody made me a ketogenic cake and it was amazing, but it was totally whole food, ketogenic food. It wasn't something that I would incorporate on a competition prep, but it was something that I could eat, enjoy, moderate, and not feel like I'm a slave to and just overconsume and overindulge. During hunting season, I'll have a couple whiskey and Cokes with a Zevia Coke. Not a regular Coke, but a Zevia Coke. That, to me, is a great way to hedge my bets and not derail me, but not cause me to feel like I'm just going to burn out either by being so incredibly strict. So knowing where your own personal, having the self-awareness to know where your boundaries lie is incredibly important, but having periods of time where you are 100% and having periods of time where you're more lax, but even on those periods of time where you're more lax, to set them up and structure them in a way that you're not going to be moving in the opposite direction, moving in the wrong direction, I think is key.
I agree. Sorry, there was a little background noise there. Kim, are you still there?
I'm sorry, guys. My headphones went wonky. I had to switch them out.
Oh, Kim, messing up my rant.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Did I screw up the sound?
Nah, you're good.
Okay. I was like, it's a good time. He's on a rant. I'll step out.
No, I think that was a good rant.
Good. I think we could have probably predicted this at the very beginning of this conversation, but it really all comes down to individuals, and there's so much nuance here. But for me, it's like, I don't believe in this balance per se, where like work-life balance, for instance, because like when you look at, kind of like this whole dual fuel system as well. Like you can't be 100% of two conflicting things at the same time. Like if you're 50% of one, you'll be 50% of the other, but you can't be 100% of both if they're conflicting. That's why I've tried to structure my life in a way that everything is symbiotic, and it's more of a work-life nutritional circle instead of balance, where it's something's teetering on one end of the spectrum or the other. And for me personally, if all of my foods are, with all the hype that keto is now, there's so many ketogenic alternatives that are like ketogenic ice creams that are good whole sources of food. They're not probably the healthiest. They probably have more sweeteners in them than is optimal, but they're not bad foods. They're just not optimal foods. And I would always personally gravitate towards that as opposed to something that is just bad food.
Yeah. And I would agree that probably goes for pretty much any food, right? Like not just keto processed stuff, but like anything. Like, and that's something too, like I used to do that for a while where I would like say like this food's bad, so I'm not going to have it. But I think that's also something too, like when you're putting like morality behind food, that I think that can also mess with your psychology, or your psychological reaction to those things. And so just kind of, and I think everybody knows like choosing the more optimal food is going to make you feel better, right? Choosing, and I always just say like, did it have a face at some point, or did it grow from the earth did it have a face at some point, or did it grow from the earth at some point? If you can check those two boxes, then generally it's probably more optimal, versus the other side of things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Any insightful words of wisdom, Kim?
Yeah. Is my no. I think one of the things that I think comes into play is, very much on the mental side, and how widening the door mentally to allow more types of foods is important. One of the things that, when I first started, we all have our embarrassing teen years, right? When I first started keto, of course, it was like all about the food list, and you can have that and you can't have that. And this is a yes, and this is a no. And then it's like, it's like the beginner's thing, right? Like mm-hmm. what you later learn, you're totally embarrassed that you used to say, but it's helpful at the same time, that black and white, yes, no. Like when you first start something, having clear rules and guidelines is very, very helpful. And, when you can kind of follow the rule of like, when in doubt, leave it out, is very helpful for keto, in my opinion, especially when you're first starting and it feels overwhelming and complex. And so the problem is, people then get stuck in those boxes where you're like, no, those were training wheels. And now it's time to really, like, if you don't know why, if it's just like, this is on the yes list, this is on the no list. If you don't know why this is on the yes list and why this is on the no list, you're kind of a slave for the rest of your life to a list, rather than being somebody that can make intelligent decisions about your health. Like, here's an example. There's a very famous bread from a company that starts with an A, out, sweeping a lot of people in the keto world, that is full, it has very, very low net carbs, right? And so people are like all about it. And then there's this other bread that I sometimes see that's like from a company called Base Culture. It has more carbs, but when you look at the comparative ingredient lists, like, I would feel safer and more comfortable with the one that has a few more carbs, because I know what those ingredients are and what they do to my body. And so I think that is not a decision that I could have made, when I first started keto with as much certainty as I can now. But I think it's all of our responsibility to know that it's complex and we are not simple individuals. I don't think we all are meant to eat more carbs. More carbs doesn't equal better. But at the same time, only paying attention to carbs is a mistake that I think is just a mistake. And so, it's a more nuanced discussion than a food list would indicate.
Yeah, I think whether you choose to eat more carbs or less carbs, either way, you should be honest with those carbs and count total carbs.
I agree.
Yeah, one of my biggest frustrations right now with the ketogenic food space, and I'm probably a little bit more biased here because I have a food product, is these companies that hide behind this net carb count, because that's what so many people in the keto space that have just recently got into the keto space are trained to look at. And with the way people can be so deceptive with what is in their product, that gripes me to no end. So anybody listening, I think we can all three agree that total carbs is key, and I think that would be a huge takeaway.
Yeah, and I think it's this place where we're trying to follow this is just human nature, right? We want to follow the letter of the law, but I think in keto, it's more important to follow the spirit of the law, right? Yeah. Is like, the letter of the law is like, well, I can do a mathematical equation that gets my carbs under 20. The spirit of the law is, if the total carbs remain under X amount, I seem to be doing a great job metabolically. And so I'm going to pay attention to that. So net carbs is all about, in my opinion, it has become about, I don't know that it was meant to be about, but it has become about playing reindeer games with your carb counts and not caring about the effects of those carbs.
Well, you just pulled a Ken Berry with that reindeer game analogy there.
I spend a little too much time with him.
But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think, people can operate well with, certain people can operate well with more carbs than others, for sure. But I think, being honest with yourself and just looking holistically at where those carbs or any other macronutrient for that matter is coming from is definitely key. And I think we would all agree that prioritizing nutrient density is important. There's just, like we said this whole time, there's so much nuance to this. And the relationship with food is so important. Like, a lot of people, and I'm probably going to have again, kind of a different perspective on this same topic than you would, Rachel, but you used the example, we can dive into this a little deeper, but you used the example of like a wedding. Like, if you're at a wedding and you're wanting to eat the cookie, you should have the cookie and be able to have the appropriate relationship with food to do so. And I'm of the perspective of, why do you feel like you're a slave to the cookie in the first place? It's like we want to accomplish the same thing. We want people to have a healthy relationship with the food they're eating, but it's just coming at it from two different perspectives.
Yeah. But I would say too, like, my perspective would be like, you shouldn't feel like you're the slave to the cookie, right? Like, you should be like, if you, not saying like you have to eat the cookie, but if you want to eat it, and then like after that, like, can you move on and go back to like your normal eating, right? Like the next day or whatever it may be, and not have this guilt behind that cookie. But I think this goes for anything, like in terms of food and the relationship with food. And I would say that one thing too, like I just want to mention, like overall, is something that really helped me was like I was kind of so stuck in my own head for a long time, and I like never, like I would always try these different things, but I never had like any type of like outside perspective or like someone who was kind of looking in from the outside saying like, okay, like maybe we should try this, or let's try this, or, you know, kind of seeing how things are going, not just in the food sense of things, but also like the lifestyle side of things, and like the other, you know, stress and sleep, and like how all those things play into also how you're maybe reacting to the things that you're doing. So I think that's something too, just to think about, like if you are listening to this and you have been struggling for a long time to kind of figure out like what does work best for you, and like maybe you've been spinning your wheels and trying to figure that out, I think that's super important to realize like it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to, you know, have someone else maybe look in and see what you're doing and maybe make outside suggestions, because we're all in our head and sometimes we can block out these things and not even realize what we're doing. So I think that's just one thing, like that's been a life changer for me, is like hiring my own coach, right? And like I think that's something that, you know, if you're listening and you are spinning your wheels, think about getting that outside perspective. Think about, you know, maybe not even just that, but like just having the accountability side of things, someone that you have to check in with every single week that you can talk through these things with, because you don't have to do it alone.
Totally. It's interesting because we all pretty much met each other at roughly the same time. We've all been in the keto space for roughly the same time. I feel like we're all kind of OGs in the space, and I feel like there's become a lot of noise within the community. There is a lot of dogmatic thinking, and I mean honestly, there's a pretty fine line between dogmatic and disciplined. I mean, where's that line drawn? It's pretty hard to know, and I am incredibly disciplined as a person, almost to a fault at times, and I don't ever want to be painted into the corner of being dogmatic as a result of that discipline. But there is so many conflicting viewpoints, and anybody that's just coming into the space new, they're not going to know where to look. So it's always cool for me to just sit down and talk with y'all, because you know we don't see each other on a regular basis, but we're hearing many of the same things when we come together and unite and just, you know, hash things out. I feel like that's just incredibly valuable for people to hear and assimilate and then break down in their own way with their own mind and figure out what resonates well with them.
Totally. I think it's important to stay open and have these discussions with people that you are not completely in alignment with, like in your mind. And then you realize that you are like, oh, we are totally aligned. It's just that like which foot we lead with kind of. And, you know, to Rachel's point, I think that either coaching or peer mentorship or just support of somebody, because it is totally true that we can get super stuck in our own head. You know, for a good year was like just banging my head against the wall, not seeing progress. I was like, I'm doing all the right things. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this other thing. I've been, you know, doing a lot of reading, I'm doing a lot of research, and like nothing was really working. And it was, you know, through conversations with Robert that I was like, oh, well, I really haven't looked at, maybe I'm under eating, maybe I'm, you know, over stressing, you know, and I had to take a year off from kind of the approach, not from keto, I stayed keto, but I had to take a year off from the kind of way that I was going about things and put those health pillars back in place or I guess I never had them. So I would in place for the first time in my life, to actually see results. And I wouldn't have seen that if I had stayed in my own little mental silo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I heard a pretty good analogy the other day, from Lane Norton of all people about these informational silos that are just running rampant everywhere in all industries right now, and in large part probably because of social media. And we live in our own echo chambers, and these form these informational silos. So there's so many silos filled with many pieces of great information, great content, but it's like we don't even, allow ourselves to be open to that information, which is incredibly detrimental. But I feel like that's why I'm just a huge fan of having these conversations. That's why we're talking for an hour and 18 minutes in now. We keep talking.
Yeah. And I think like to bridge the point between you guys and the ice cream and no ice cream, or the cupcake at the wedding. And I would like to urge people that if you're going to have a cupcake, choose one that's better than a wedding cupcake. I've never anyway, but
I don't know why I just always think of a wedding. I guess I just keep using that same example. It's just like literally just like any event.
I am teasing you. Is a couple of years ago, I was in Lake Tahoe with my family, my brother and all his little kids and my parents, and we all went out for ice cream, and it was this lovely setting, and we were outside eating ice cream, and I just didn't get an ice cream. Like I was like, I'm here with you guys eating ice cream. And there was this moment that I like kind of checked in emotionally with myself, and I was like, I am 100% fine not eating ice cream right now. Like it was there, because I've certainly been in lots of situations where I've not eaten ice cream, but I've desperately wanted to eat the ice cream. And I was like, I don't really care about the ice cream. And that experience was incredibly freeing. I don't feel like I'm a better person because I didn't eat the ice cream, though. I think that's really important because I grew up in a household where it was good or bad. You were good or bad if you ate or didn't eat, right? And I released the sort of mental judgment. But I also felt, to Robert's kind of perspective, I think a little bit more, the freedom of the lack of need. And I think there's a place that until you've gotten there, there's probably some emotional work to be done in choosing to have the ice cream, because I feel like after having enough experiences where I could choose not to have the ice cream and not have it pull on me, I'm in a mental space where I actually can choose. Whereas before then, I don't know that I could have called it a choice.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I'm going to say I completely agree too, because literally that's exactly kind of how I feel too as well. And like I've gone through, periods of like when I was strict keto, that was one of the reasons why I was like, this is really amazing because I can go into, walk past a donut shop or whatever and smell the donuts and not have that urge to need the donut, or go out to ice cream with people and not have I have the freedom to not feel like I'm missing out. And I still have that freedom now, but that's because I have gone through that period of, like you said, exactly like that period of time where I just kept saying no, right? Like I said no. And then I realized that, I didn't die afterwards and I didn't feel like I was missing out, and you kind of just practice that behavior. And then maybe you do get to the point where, you are incorporating more carbs or whatever it is. And then maybe you do, like in one situation, you do have a bite of the donut, but then in maybe the next situation you don't, or maybe you do have the piece of cake at the wedding. And then maybe you don't. And I think it's just kind of realizing what's worth it to you in the sense of that. But can you also, be, open to that and to be aware. I think just the awareness part of things, that's like something that I focus on a lot with myself and my clients, is just like being aware of the situation. But I totally agree with what you said, Kim, being able to go through those periods of time where you can just say constantly say no, because you're really just trying to kind of training your mind to say, it's okay to say no and I don't need that. And then maybe, further down the line, you continue to say no, but then maybe you do say yes once in a while. So I think, so I agree with that.
Okay.
Can I say one more little tangent?
Sure.
I feel like a lot of people use their other family members or their kids as a scapegoat to incorporate foods when they don't even have a good relationship with foods in the first place. And that's been a big frustration for me. Like I think like a lot of people use kids. I mean, kids are much more insulin sensitive. It's kind of going the opposite direction now, but generally speaking, kids are much more insulin sensitive. They're going through growth spurts. They're burning a lot of calories, running around outside all day, and they can tolerate a lot more carbs. I'm not suggesting that kids just be super strict keto, but what I am saying is that a lot of parents let their kids eat low quality foods that are much higher in carbs, and then they feel like they're supposed to allow themselves to eat those foods with their kids in order to enrich their relationship with their kids. And that, to me, I feel like is a massive cop-out and a big frustration.
Yeah, I would agree. Also, I think I get this a lot. Like, I don't know, Rachel probably does as well. I am the only keto one in my house. How do I do this? And in my house, my boyfriend is not keto. My cabinets are full of things. I mean, not full, but they include things that I do not eat. But I haven't broken into the Chips Ahoy, right? I don't eat them. I'm actually, if I'm going to eat something carby, I'm a lot more likely to say, when I'm at a fancy restaurant on a holiday, be like, I will have one bite of your chocolate souffle, because to me, that's worth it versus this kind of low quality carby food that I don't really have any interest in. But I think that is, again, to what Rachel and I talked about a minute ago, like, it's a muscle you work. And I feel like I'm a stronger person with better boundaries now, being the only keto one in my house. Then, it would be easier if everybody in the whole world ate the way that I do, but that's unlikely to happen. And I think you can get there where you can walk down the carb-filled grocery aisle because you took a wrong turn and not put anything in your cart.
Definitely. And that should be liberating. I mean, there's a time where I wouldn't allow myself to walk through the bakery section of a grocery store because that pulled on me. So now I can walk right through it. I don't care. And I feel like that's where people need to be able to get.
Yeah.
Well, what else are we going to talk about? We pretty much hit all the main topics. What are y'all excited about? What's 2020 got in store for you for the rest of the year?
2020 has been an interesting one. Yeah.
Ready for 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost here. It's getting pretty close. We need to have I don't know if any of the conferences are going to be back in action next year. I'm not sure, but I feel like we say this every time we talk, but all these conferences that were canceled this year and have kept us from interacting face-to-face like we normally do has been a huge frustration for all of us. And I'm just incredibly excited for us all to regroup in person, face-to-face, like humans are supposed to interact. And I'm really looking forward to that. So I miss y'all, and I can't wait to see you in person.
Same.
Absolutely.
When's your compound part 2 going to be complete?
We'll probably move in June or July of next year, but it's going to be so sweet. When we move in, I'm going to have the podcast set up all for in-person recordings, and I'm going to fly y'all both out there. All expense paid. We'll have a full-blown podcast. We'll work out together. We'll do whatever. It'll be an experience instead of just a Zoom call.
Well, let's do it. I'm stoked.
That's good. Hey, Robert, I just got a shipment of your new flavor of Keto Brick in, so I'm going to do a little live later today and share my experience.
Nice. Rachel said she's going to try it for breakfast tomorrow, so y'all both have to let me know what you think.
Sounds good.
Will do.
Well, where can people go to find all of us, since this is all going out on our different platforms? I guess we'll just start with you, Rachel. Where are you located?
I am located on MetFlexLife.com. MetFlexLife.com is my website, and on social media, I'm most active on Instagram. My handle's at rachelgregory.cns. And if you like to see puppies on a daily basis, I blow my story with my puppy because I just can't help it. So,
did you just get a puppy?
I did about a month ago now. I can't believe it's already a month.
Oh.
Pretty much the cutest Instagram story of all of them now. I literally just watch your puppy and it makes my day happy.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Hopefully it doesn't annoy people because that's all I post lately.
I mean, right now we could take as many puppies as we can get, Rachel.
All right. Well, I'll keep that up, and I'll blame you guys if I get any.
Well, hopefully your account doesn't get disabled or something crazy like that,
Yeah, I know, right? Who's gonna deny a puppy? Come on.
I know.
You can't do that.
What about you, Kim?
So I'm at kimhowerton.com, and you can find me on the socials at The Ketonist, which is TheKetonist.
Nice. I am ketosavage.com, and I am at ketobrick.com for our meal replacement bar. Instagram is ketosavage, and at livesavage, because my account did get disabled for a minute, and it wasn't because I was posting a bunch of puppy videos, so I don't know what was going on there. But Keto Savage and Live Savage, and that will wrap up this podcast. So, yeah, y'all have a great one.
All right. Love you guys. See you soon.
Take care.
See ya.
Bye.
All right, I hope you enjoyed listening to that episode with Robert and Kim. Definitely check out Robert and Kim on social media. I linked their Instagram pages, their Facebook pages, and their websites in the show notes. So you can swipe up if you're listening to this on iTunes, or you can find the show notes on my website if you go to metflexlife.com and hit the little menu button in the top right-hand corner of the page and click podcasts. All the show notes for every single podcast is there with all the information. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you are enjoying the podcast in general, please make sure to leave a review on iTunes. That's really helpful to help spread the word about the show. And then also you can, share it out on social media. Tag me on Instagram. My handle is @rachelgregory.cns. That also helps spread the word about the show and get more people interested and listening. All right, I'll talk to you next time.